Welcome to On Air. I'm Klara Serevich. Following the fanfare around enlargement 2 years ago, EU leaders now face a thicket of obstacles. Today we'll walk through that minefield, and in our report we'll look at the countries that snub EU membership despite being given the red carpet treatment. Feast your eyes on the EU's latest flagship initiative, the growth plan for the Western Balkans, a fresh whiff of vigour in the wheezing lungs of the enlargement process.
You cannot stop the wind of change from blowing. Today, the wind of change is blowing again here in the Western Balkans, as well as in Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia and across our continent.
That's how Commission President Ursula von der Leyen framed it during her visit to Tirana last year in a bid to revive the EU's expansion. 6 Balkan candidates were promised a taste of membership perks in the form of 6.4 billion euros in grants and loans to nudge reforms. Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama, ever the optimist, said talks will be wrapped up within 2 years and Albania will join the EU by 2027. The country has been a candidate for over a decade, although technically accession negotiations began only last October. Still, the rather flamboyant Rama seemed emboldened by the EU's noticeably brisker pace and nicer tone.
Now they are very eager to go forward. With the Russian aggression, everything changed. So somehow, Vladimir Putin also did this. He made Europe much more interested in unifying.
It just so happens that every new EU candidate is seen by Moscow as part of its God-given sphere of influence, and breaking free is a big affront, worthy of invasion. Besides occupying Ukraine, Russia has already managed to steer one hopeful, Georgia, away from the EU. Its candidacy was recently frozen, along with that of old-timer Turkey, due to their respective descent into authoritarianism. All the more reason for Brussels to lead a charm offensive from Moldova to Serbia to reaffirm the bloc's political and financial backing. As Denmark took over the EU's rotating presidency on Tuesday, enlargement was its top priority, described as the only way to strengthen the resilience of countries exposed to unwanted external influence. Very enigmatic. There's no question EU expansion has delivered more positives than negatives, though I admit I'm biased as a latecomer from Poland. But numbers speak for themselves. Since Poland joined 20 years ago, the EU economy has grown by 27% and internal trade by over 40%. Industries scaled up, agricultural variety has exploded. The EU now has a larger pool of servicemen, from army reservists to border guards, and a bigger single market, which makes it a more attractive trading partner. But beyond economic benefits, enlargement is an influence exercise, stabilizing an ever-widening neighborhood. So what's not to like? Well, each candidate country, past and present, is both a wellspring of unbound potential and a simultaneous help-it. So there's no point in making generalizations. The problem is not so much what newcomers can offer us, but more what we can really offer them. For most citizens in aspiring EU countries, the greatest appeal of membership boils down to 2 things: freedom of movement and economic prosperity. And the latter hinges on EU funding. While candidates get modest pre-accession aid, the real money flows once you're in, except that post-accession windfall is no longer guaranteed. With hard lessons learned from Hungary, Slovakia and to a lesser extent Poland, EU funds are now firmly tied to rule of law compliance. And that means aspiring members are facing ever-mounting scrutiny. For candidate countries, the message is clear. Even after surviving the long, often humiliating road to accession, key benefits like financial solidarity can still be withheld or subject to shifting benchmarks. The result is a predictable new cycle of disillusionment. And by new, I mean there's already a big enlargement fatigue on both sides of this conversation. Consider that the Western Balkans were formally promised a credible path to EU membership back in 2003, with high hopes of joining within a decade. That disappointment is especially stinging when standards applied to some have been overlooked in others. The Commission's selective blindness to rule of law breaches has allowed democratic backsliding in places like Serbia to go largely unchecked. That eyes have closed vision has also been applied to some extent in war-ravaged Ukraine. But both countries are just strategically too important for the EU to play the virtue police. Except none of this exactly burnishes the EU's image. In the end, much of the success of enlargement boils down to narratives, and the EU is steadily losing ground in several candidate countries. 57% of Serbians say they don't trust the EU. In North Macedonia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that number hovers around 40%. Russia and China are quick to exploit these resentments, casting themselves as preferable alternatives. What complicates things even further is the internal unease overshadowing the enlargement process. Behind the EU's polished facade, domestic debates often tell a different story. There's anxiety about governance deficits that, over time, can breed another Hungary, and apprehension about unresolved bilateral tensions in candidate countries like Serbia and Bosnia. And then there's the spectre of mass population movements. Despite the economic need for more workers, EU countries remain haunted by the Brexit syndrome, where public backlash to internal EU migration helped tip the scales in favour of leaving. The latest wave of refugees from Ukraine, a candidate country, has already given far-right parties a backdrop to boost their support base. With mainstream politicians now echoing far-right stances on external migration, the difference between Italy's Giorgia Meloni and Denmark's Social Democratic Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, who's led some of the EU's toughest migration policies, is increasingly hard to spot. That's the same Denmark now holding the rotating European Council presidency, not exactly a reassuring sign for candidate countries. Just consider how long it took for Bulgaria and Romania to join the Schengen area. Despite being EU members for nearly 20 years, their citizens were still stuck at passport controls until this January. So there goes the other top perk of membership, mobility. What about prosperity? For countries like France or Poland, much of it has come from generous agricultural subsidies. But according to the EU Agriculture Commissioner, with Ukraine's potential accession, the bloc will move away from area-based payments. To put the scale in perspective, he pointed out,
in Ukraine, you have agricultural holdings of 600,000 hectares. That's 4 times the entire production of the member state where I come from.
This state happens to be Luxembourg. Plus, let's be honest, the current system hasn't exactly run like clockwork. In Greece, fake farmers were able to scam EU subsidies for years, allegedly siphoning off around 290 million euros, with more than a nod from government officials. But scamming the EU isn't Greece's exclusive talent. It's more of a spécialité de la maison for 2 other member states. Besides funneling said funds to friends and family or skimming cash off energy imports from Russia, those countries also came up with a fund pay to vote or pay not to veto system within the EU Council. You know who I'm talking about. You might have caught the latest episode of their saga during the vote on the 18th round of Russian sanctions, complete with some live blackmail. But before that spectacle, Viktor Orban also managed to block Ukraine's enlargement at the EU Council. Every negotiation cluster needs unanimous support to open, and Hungary has consistently slammed the door, going so far as to stage a widely criticised domestic referendum on Ukraine's membership. Still, Ukrainians are not losing hope, as the country's ambassador to the EU said,
I'm sure we'll be able to convince Hungary to get on board.
Good luck with that. Looks like you have to lock Viktor Orban in the toilet. No, seriously, that's practically what happened when the EU managed to open accession talks last December. Although Orban's bathroom elope was prearranged, it turned out that legally an absence could be read as an abstention. But what does it say about EU decision-making if this is what it takes to get things done? And now we'll need 2 cubicles because Robert Fico will have to be locked in there too. You might thus forgive Germany's Conservatives and Social Democrats for sneaking into their coalition agreement, a buried yet momentous document, that their government will oppose any further EU enlargement unless the bloc scraps its unanimity rule. And they're right. With 35 member states, each holding veto power, decision-making will be mind-boggling. And this is where it becomes clear that the EU must fundamentally reform itself before it can credibly take in new members. But since ending the unanimity rule would require unanimity, the most likely scenario implies something already rehearsed with the backpedaling on Brexit. It's the EU's all-time favourite, the half measure. The EU will most likely become its own Frankenstein, with many new members languishing in the eternal antechamber. Some might gain freedom of movement, others partial access to the single market. A few will adopt the euro or not, like Poland. Defence spending targets will be met or not, like in Spain and Slovakia. And inevitably, some will block key decisions in exchange for funds, while others will have to play along. Not every country dreams of a seat at Brussels' crowded table, though some would be welcomed without any scrutiny, like, say, Norway. The problem is they don't want to. Find out why in this report.
Several European countries have chosen to remain outside the European Union, citing a variety of political, economic and cultural reasons. Norway has twice rejected EU membership through referendums in 1972 and 1994. The opposition has long argued that membership would undermine national sovereignty, particularly over natural resources like oil and gas, as well as fisheries and hydroelectric power. Oil and gas exports are vital to the Norwegian economy, and there is a strong belief that Norway can manage these resources more effectively outside of the EU's regulatory framework. Instead of full membership, Norway opted for the EEA agreement, which provides access to the EU's single market while retaining its own currency, advantageous in managing the trade of its robust natural resources. Similarly, Iceland has also not joined the EU, though it is a member of the European Economic Area and Schengen. A key reason for its non-membership is the fishing industry, which many fear would be undermined by the common fisheries policy, limiting Iceland's control over its waters.
Those who advocate a membership say that all that could be solved, but fisheries is an important factor for the Norwegian people.
Similar concerns exist in the agricultural sector, where EU rules are seen as a threat to native farmers. Iceland's electoral system favors rural areas, which tend to be more Eurosceptic, making accession unlikely. Switzerland also maintains independence from the EU despite extensive economic ties through bilateral agreements. Swiss voters rejected joining the European Economic Area in 1992 and again resisted closer political integration in 2021 by abandoning negotiations for a framework treaty. Fears of wage dumping due to higher Swiss wages and the impact on Switzerland's tradition of direct democracy have driven the public away from considering accession. For sectors like finance, Switzerland's relatively slim regulatory framework remains a market advantage. Decades of deindustrialization, followed by years of public spending cuts and high immigration, made fertile ground for the argument that Brexit would let the UK take back control of its borders, laws and economy. However, 5 years after Brexit formally took effect, many of the promised benefits remain elusive. Estimates show both exports and imports will be around 15% lower in the long term than they would have been inside the EU.
The uncertainty it's created has led to lower business investment. The new trade barriers has made it harder for UK firms to trade with the EU. Overall, the UK is poorer now because of Brexit.
Ironically, immigration, one of the central issues in the Leave campaign, has increased as new visa schemes have opened the doors to workers from beyond Europe. Public opinion has shifted significantly, with most polls now showing a majority of Britons believe leaving the EU was a mistake.
It's just so sad because we miss out on so many things. The young people are suffering from it in all the countries and in our country. And it just seemed such a pointless thing to do when we're worse off now than we were before. And we need our friends in Europe.
But despite the shift, rejoining the bloc remains a distant prospect.
Speaking of joining, we hope you'll join us again in September. And in the meantime, On Air is taking a holiday break. Have fun this summer, and we'll see you soon.